Okay, welcome to a virtual tour of the Baylands. Here's a map of the Baylands Park in Palo Alto. And for most of our tour, we're going to be up here in this area. First, we're going to park right in this parking lot here. This is the view as you're in the parking lot of the Baylands Park. It's a big salt marsh, almost 2,000 acres of mudflats, salt marsh, and estuary habitats. So we're going to walk down this boardwalk, and I'm just going to let you listen to all the birds that are here in the Baylands. Okay, so we just transitioned from the parking lot, which is sort of a higher elevation, through the mud, through a little bit of salt marsh onto the mud flats, and now we're looking at water draining out of the estuary. This is at a pretty low tide, and water's leaving these streams and going into the estuary. Critically, these habitats are really productive, and so it's really unique for us in the Bay Area to have such a beautiful area that's been protected from development. And so as we walk along the road in the Baylands Park, you can see this really extensive salt marsh. And these salt marshes are very productive habitats. There's a lot of photosynthesis going on, a lot of carbon capture from the air, and using sunlight for that carbon capture, but they're really low diversity habitats. This is during low tide, but these habitats get regularly flooded by salt water from San Francisco Bay estuary, and salt water is toxic to plants. Having salt on their roots is very bad for them, and so most plants can't survive this harsh habitat. So what we see is relatively low diversity of plant life in the salt marshes, although high productivity. You can see that for the most part, the plants are covering 100% of the space, except where it's flooded, and right now at low tide. And one of the major plants here in the Baylands is called pickleweed. And this is pickleweed. It's kind of got a fleshy, sort of succulent morphology, and it can dominate up to 100% cover of a lot of the solid land in this salt marsh. Pickleweed has adaptations to get rid of salt. And then the other plant that survives in this habitat is cordgrass. Pickleweed and cordgrass can regularly get flooded by seawater during high tides, and these plants have adapted to tolerate high salt concentrations. That special adaptation to survive in salty areas is really critical for all the other creatures that live in the salt marsh. And so there's a ton of little invertebrates that burrow in the mud. There's a lot of birds that look for little creatures in the mud and eat plants, and just are foraging on anything they can find. And so this almost 2,000 acres in Palo Alto is actually a key habitat for birds because it's so rare in the San Francisco Bay Area. Um, there's less than 1% of this salt marsh left. And so the Baylands is really well known as a place for wildlife watching, bird watching. There's a lot of different kind of birds that come here. Some that fly through on their migration north, and some birds that are permanent residents. And there's a whole suite of different birds that either eat the invertebrates in the mud or the insects flying around this habitat. And critically, these birds are, and critically, this habitat, especially this marshy area here in kind of the middle of the Baylands Park, is very important for this bird life. And you can kind of see as we walk along the road, we're heading towards the visitor center, that the road has been uplifted from the salt marsh. And so we've added 1 or 2 feet of elevation, and you can see the plants change at higher elevation. And this is because these plants aren't exposed to salt water as often. And so normal plants can live in these higher elevations, and they're much better competitors than the pickleweed or the cordgrass. And so it ends up that salt marsh plants aren't very good competitors because they've evolved to tolerate salinity instead of competing with other plants. And so we see this sort of exclusion zone where the salt marsh plants don't come to higher elevations, but we get a lot more diversity of plants at higher elevations because they're not exposed to regular flooding of their roots by seawater during high tide. And so the diversity of the salt marsh is quite low in terms of plants, but again, the productivity is really high. There's a lot of photosynthesis going on here, and that supports the whole food web in the entire Bay Area ecosystem. So the estuary itself, and an estuary is where fresh and saltwater meet, is really productive because there's a lot of nutrients coming in from fresh water. So there's a lot of primary productivity going on, a lot of photosynthesis. And this productivity supports all sorts of little invertebrates that live in the mud, fish, and higher trophic creatures like sharks and larger fish that are predators. And this salt marsh is actually a really important source of carbon into the estuary. So as these salt marsh plants die, their carbon sort of rolls downhill into the mudflat and gets into the estuary, and it's eaten by detritivores, so snails and bacteria, and those are all processing carbon and helping to support the food web. They're the foundation of the food web. So now we're walking along the road towards the visitor center, and this is a really pretty part of the Baylands Park. The Lucy Evans Nature Center is really a great resource for students. Has a lot of nice displays. You can see it there at the top of the screen. This visitor center has visitors from school classrooms that come, and a whole suite of people who come and just walk around the Baylands and enjoy being outside for a little while. Again, you can see in this salt marsh habitat that it's really dominated by these 2 plants, cordgrass and pickleweed. You can see the pools, the sort of muddy pools in the background. Because it's such low tide today, those pools don't have any seawater in them. But when at high tide, they will be full of water, just sort of like this little estuary is. This tidal basin is also at low tide, but you can see the mudflats have been exposed. But know that these mudflats are also really rich areas of diversity, and so there's a ton of, you can kind of see the brown-green slime on the top. That's an algae that's photosynthesizing and capturing carbon, and that algae is providing food for all sorts of invertebrates and grazers and crabs that live both on the surface of the mud, the epifauna, and those invertebrates that burrow into the mud, the infauna. And the ones that burrow into the mud are usually worms and clams and filter feeders, and so they stick their snouts out of the mud, and then they can collect food from the water as it passes over them. And so here's a nice view of the Lucy Evans Visitor Center. The Visitor Center provides habitat for some creatures because it's structure in this salt marsh. And so they've actually built small nesting boxes for swallows. And so you can see here some of the swallows are flying through the visitor center in this time-lapse video. And you can see that there's some people making use of the park. This is a pretty early morning in April. Okay, now behind the visitor center is this really beautiful boardwalk that goes out for I don't know how long, 200 yards maybe, 300 yards, pretty far out from the salt marsh. Across the salt marsh, you can see here again dominated by cordgrass, which is kind of the frilly grass at the top, and pickleweed, which is all the green sort of in the middle. This boardwalk was recently redone, but you can see an old boardwalk that we can't walk on anymore. I guess it's deteriorated so much that is there to access these towers with the electric lines in them. But I just wanted you to see in this video how extensive this salt marsh habitat is and how extensive it should be, right? Because what we're looking at is only 1% of the salt marshes that should be present in San Francisco Bay Area. And now we're looking out over the estuary. Again, it's low tide, so we're looking at these expansive mudflats that are full of both epifauna and infauna. And these organisms are taking advantage of all this photosynthesis that's going on in this really productive ecosystem. During high tide, all that mudflat is covered, and know that we are in one of the biggest estuaries in the country in San Francisco Bay, and the Golden Gate Bridge is the opening of the bay. The bay is sort of considered to be these 4 or 5 units, where most of the freshwater input is coming in from the delta. But San Francisco Bay has been altered extensively. It's been filled in. Almost half of the area that used to be salt marshes is all filled in. This area at the top, across the bay from the Baylands, used to be a salt factory, and now they're talking about restoring that. And so what's really special about Baylands Park is that we're looking at how the San Francisco Bay used to look like. And hopefully after some restoration efforts, it can look like that again. Okay, now we're looking out over the estuary. It's low tide, so we're looking at the mudflats. Again, a lot of creatures live in these mudflats. That's why the birds are out here scavenging for things. In this estuary, San Francisco Bay Estuary has been one of the most changed places on the planet. And so it has been greatly affected by our use of fresh water. So from the Delta system, we've taken a lot of the fresh water that used to come into the San Francisco Bay, and we've moved it for human uses, agriculture, and consumption. We've introduced a ton of species into the bay because of our shipping traffic that goes all around the world. And so it's really hard for us to know what the ecology of San Francisco Bay used to be. But we can use some techniques in historical ecology, like these Native American middens. You can see over here at the left of this image is a midden, and those are shells that were left by Native Americans when they used to come here and scavenge. And you can see there were a lot of oysters and clam shells there that we don't see so much in San Francisco Bay anymore. A lot of the native oysters were extinguished due to human harvesting during the gold rush. A lot of this fine sediment in San Francisco Bay is from all the mining activity that took place in the rivers upstream of San Francisco Bay in the 1800s. And so the actual foundation of the bay itself, the bottom of it, and the food webs that survived has been greatly altered by infilling, making land for buildings, invasive species, which has completely changed the food webs, and human extraction, effectively. Okay, so as part of our field trip, we're going back towards the visitor center across that long boardwalk. You can see here past the visitor center is that boardwalk that goes out into the bay, and then we're going to walk out of the park away from the visitor center and kind of go upland and see how the vegetation is changing. And so critically, I think for us is understanding that while this is a really beautiful park, and it provides this really great resource for us as open space and for birds as habitat for them to stop over on their migrations or as places to forage for their food. Know that this park represents a very small portion of San Francisco Bay, and that it's probably less than 1% of the bay looks like this, with extensive salt marshes, really big mud flats, and access to the estuary during high tide. We can actually see the estuary sort of flood the mud flats in these open pools that we're looking at. So San Francisco Bay has been greatly altered by humans. Clearly, we have a big impact on a lot of different habitats, but I would argue that this particular marine habitat, this estuary, has been greatly changed. Okay, and so as a concluding sort of piece to this field trip, we're going to walk out of the park along the road, and you can see these big extensive pools that are pretty low at low tide, and the mud flats associated with those pools. But also notice that how the vegetation is changing. So as we're leaving the park, we're going a little bit more uphill, and so the elevation is increased by a couple feet, and we're starting to see a lot more diversity of plants. And that's because these plants are not regularly exposed to salt water during high tide, and that's because we've elevated this section of the path. And so, also critically to understand about estuaries is that our human land use is really connected to the health of the system. And so, if we fill in land, clearly there's no room for all these native species to live. So one last view over the Baylands. Beautiful park. I highly recommend it. Thanks for coming, and have a great day.